Our guest today is Bill Nasson, Emeritus Professor in History at Stellenbosch University, who previously worked at UCT from 1982 to 2009. One of the giants in our field, his writings on the history of war, society, and empire have secured a broad professional and public readership, as testified by many awards, including his A rating from the National Research Foundation, his winning the Recht Milan Prize for Best Nonfiction, and the translation of his works into Dutch, German, French, and Italian. He will be speaking to us today about his life and history. Welcome, Bill.
Welcome, Bill.
Welcome. Hi. Hello. Thanks very much for having me. It's an honor.
Well, we feel the same way.
It's an honor to be treated by the young, So once you get to my age,
to be regarded by the young. So, Bill, please tell us a bit about your upbringing and what kindled your interest in history as a subject.
This is a complicated question. I grew up in a house with very few books, for example. For the first thing is that the books consisted of the Reader's Digest, condensed, those sort of books I used to subscribe to. My parents subscribed. And they were very religious. So they were, Book of Common Prayer and the Bible. And I guess libraries were my sort of refuges from a very young age. Cape Town Library, Wynberg Library, before they were sort of segregated. They were open public libraries in Cape Town. And I guess I just enjoyed books about the past in a sort of very general way, not about the South African past. They were mainly about the British past, 1066 and all that. And so that's very young. And then I guess I had really fantastic history teachers at school who kept up an interest in history and taught a sort of nonconformist kind of history. So when I was at high school, we had a sort of hidden curriculum. I think that's a fancy term now, that you were taught to render that which Caesar needed to be rendered to. And then you were taught another kind of alternative history underneath it all. So I think that always kept me interested in history. Although my first love was always actually literature. I've always loved, I love fiction and writing. And I think those two things went together from a very early age. So I think we all are what we were as children in some ways. Yeah.
Could you tell me a bit more about that high school of yours and the hidden curriculum?
Yeah, but also where it was in the west. We've got an idea with general Western Cape.
Claremont, in sort of southern suburbs of Cape Town, and it was one of a small number of what were generally called at the time sort of unity movement schools, so the non-European unity movement, which had been banned in 1960, but the unity movement ethos sort of continued. And the consequence of that was that you had a very sort of deep, profound sort of, teaching influence and experience about the importance of non-racialism and also about socialism. So I would say that I may not have the beliefs I had in socialism now, but I have that strong belief in non-racialism. And the other thing was internationalism, which was incredibly important in the way in which we're taught. So we were always taught about the world, and to read about the world, which is what many of us, along with me, we all did. So my interest in history was never really about South Africa. It was just anywhere else, if possible. So so anywhere other than South Africa was what I wanted to read about, both in novels and in nonfiction. So so that was kind of school, and then I had fantastic undergraduate lecturers who kept my interest in history.
But I think that's what history and literature has in common, is it can transport you to other places.
Well, that's it. It's imaginative, I've always thought that history takes you somewhere else in the way that novels take you somewhere else. And I use that. I used to use that in my teaching quite often, that, if you teach the history of war, you can quite often just read good novels about the experience of war, because they can get, you don't talk about truth these days, but they do. Novels can get you to a kind of truth that history can't, in that imaginative spring your imagination way. So yeah, so I think those two things have kept me going.
So in your journey, we've got to high school, and we're still not yet on the history track. So because your literature and history is a part of that. So can you tell us about?
I was quite good at history at school. No, I was actually very good at history at school because I have a very good memory, which is probably the only thing I can claim to, actually. I mean, I was never good at anything else, but I do have a good memory, and that was good actually because I organized the school. We had a sort of debating society, and we had a current affairs society, and I was kind of almost naturally, I think, in charge of that because I had a very good memory, and so I did very well in sort of history exams because there was a lot of rote learning, and I was terrible at everything else. So I used to sort of cheat at maths and stuff. I could never do maths, but the school exams were set in such a way that you wrote alongside someone who was doing maths. And then, so in fact, you would copy from them, but then you would allow them to copy from your history. That seemed to me, the nearest thing I've got to Marx, to each according to his need. So that was I cheated a lot in school. I mean, I'm going to be quite honest about that now, why bother? What else do I have to hide? But no, I mean, I was good at history at school, and I was good at English at school. So that's the thing, that they were both subjects which I loved and did quite well at. Yeah, but not anything else. I mean, certainly not Afrikaans. I got an F in matric, and then I retook a sup, and then I got a double F, which is many ironies in my life. That's one of those. Yeah, no. Anyway, yes.
Yeah. So tell me, Bill. I am interested in how you got from South Africa to the UK, but I'm also interested, I think I once heard something about your first job. Could you tell us about that?
My first job, yeah. Well, what happened when I got matric, and then it was a time when you certainly didn't go to UWC, which was known as Bush, if possible. So if you were kind of middle class from a middling family, you certainly didn't go there. So you tried to get to UCT, and there were a restricted range of subjects which you could study at UCT, and you needed a permit. So you could only apply for something like, if I remember now, business science, which is quite funny actually, because I did apply for business science, or classics, and something else, medicine and so on. I mean, useless things actually for me. So, and then I didn't get a permit. So, so the option then was going to UWC, and my parents were on no account having me go to Bush. So then I enrolled for correspondence with the SACED, the South African Committee for Higher Education. And you could then do University of London overseas A-levels, and then if you did well enough, you might get a scholarship. So that is what I did after I finished matric. So that would have been after 1970. And then my first job was working in a sort of British electronics factory in Plumstead in Cape Town, southern suburbs. And among other things, is where I met P.W. Botha, who was then Minister of Defence. And I've actually written about that. And he came to tour the factory one day with his pork pie hat. And yeah, so that was my encounter. We all lined up for Pierre. There he was. Because Plessy was in fact supplying the South African Defence Force secretly. I mean, they were breaking the arms embargo, but they were supplying the South African Defence Force with things for the Navy and the Air Force. So these things would arrive. These things would arrive from Liverpool and so on as electronics, but in fact they were convertible for military use. But so I worked there for about a year, and then I studied part-time, and that was an interesting experience because I was working in this this sort of small part of the factory, and I'm all proud Afrikaans. I mean, they were from the Cape Flats and so on. I was the only English-speaking person there, and I'd had matric, and so it was an interesting immersion in sort of laboring life and being that was an interesting experience. I would bring my lunch in Tupperware containers, and on Mondays it would have roast chicken or beef left over from Sunday, And they would always come with peanut butter and apricot, so the little markers of class were there all the time. Yeah. So that was about a year, and then so I studied part-time and then did A-levels and then got a scholarship to Hull. So that got, so that got me to England. I got to England that way. Couldn't wait.
And what were your experiences of England? Was it a culture shock? Did you feel at home? What was the life like at Hull?
No, it wasn't actually. So interesting. Lots of people. No, it wasn't, because in the 60s, I sort of grew up here with British comics and British newspapers, and, we listened to the BBC, and you just had this vision of England and then I used to bunk off school in the 60s to visit Royal Navy ships, which came here because of Ian Smith. I've got Ian Smith to thank for that. The Byra Patrol during UDI and sanctions. So these Royal Navy ships would come here. And we used to bunk off school and go down to the docks, Cape Town docks. And not on the days when, they were open to the public. You just went to the docks and you're hanging around there. And then these jackdaws would lean over the railing and said, come on up. And we'd get ham and cheese sandwiches and get taken around. And it was a great time. But then you were it was the nearest you got to leaving the country. You walked up the gangplank and you walked onto this British ship, and that filled all your myths and fantasies and so on about Britain. So when I went there, it actually wasn't it wasn't a culture shock. I spoke the language as well as most of the natives. And the north of England was interesting because, you grew up here and your image of England is the south, sort of London and so on. But then I went to Hull in, 200 miles away in northeast Yorkshire, where there were lots of Yorkshire people. And that was, it wasn't a culture, it was a very friendly place. I'm still, some of my happiest years of my life were spent there, because inflation was very low. You could live like a king on my scholarship that I had there for my undergraduate years. And I had a wonderful time as an undergraduate. Wonderful, actually. I can't begin to say how much enjoyment I got out of it. Lecturers would have you around for sherry, like that, on Sundays before lunch. That's the English thing. So you come for sherry and you get an invitation. That's what I remember. Alan Lee used to invite us for like twice a term for sherry. 11, and wouldn't be a Spanish sherry because of Franco. So they would boycott Franco's sherry. So he had this rather terrible Cyprus sherry called Ember Cream. But Alan said, we can't have Spanish. We won't have Spanish sherry in the house. So it's a bit like not having South African stuff, Geen out Spain in the Netherlands. So it was, but then, it would be 11 till 1, and then at 1 you'd all go, because that's when Alan and his family were going to have lunch. And I think in South Africa, you'd say, well, stay and get some pizza. You know what I mean? But it was wonderful, actually. Yeah. It was, yeah. So I think, and I enjoyed all the history I did, and I enjoyed all the literature I did. And and we did, did Commonwealth literature, and you end up studying Caribbean literature and Australian literature and Nigerian literature and East African, studied in Gugu and Achebe, 1973. Not in a deconstructionist, post-colonial, whatever way, but you got exposed to all of those writers. So it was great. I sound like a fogger now, but I had it was very cold. It was very cold and terrible in winter. Well, you don't go to England for nice weather. But Hull University was an interesting place because they had lots of working class students from the north, and they had quite a lot of mature students. And then there were Chilean students who turned up in 74 because of the Chilean coup and so on. So it was a very interesting, and there were about 4,000 students. It's much bigger now. The history department then had about 25 lecturers, and each year they took 80 students. And so it meant that the lecturer tutored you. So there was no escape, Yeah. You would have, your tutorial would have about 4 or 5 students, and you had to write your essays and discuss your essays. And so it was,
No, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
I had the same
Yeah.
at King's College London when I did my undergraduate there. It's a really special if you've got that student-staff ratio, and we don't know what was missing in the South African context. But then you did your doctorate at Cambridge. What was your subject matter? Who did you study under, and what were your memories of Cambridge?
Cambridge, Cambridge as a student, I liked not so much. I mean, I just found it a bit up yourself and snotty and elitist. So at Cambridge, I sort of fell in with people who went there to do PhDs, but had been at more ordinary universities, if you see what I mean. So we hung out together. So Cambridge, I mean, I loved Cambridge's resources and the most wonderful library, one of the most wonderful libraries imaginable. And I had a sort of scholarship, and then when I came here to do research, that was paid for by the Smuts Commonwealth Fund, which I thought was quite sweet. I rather liked that, actually. Yeah, benefiting from Yanni. And I had a very good supervisor, John Lonsdale, who's in his 80s now, and he was he was terrific sort of supervisor. He just let you go. I mean, he just there was almost no supervision. Just go off and research and do that for a year. And in the second year, you come back and discuss it. And in the third year, you write each one chapter a month. And at the end of the third year, that's how you get your PhD. I mean, Andre Oudendal was told by another supervisor just to go and play cricket for Cambridge because he was a cricketer. And then, and then we can start discussing things in the second year. So it was quite, non-interventionist, I think. Mm-hmm. Which I enjoyed, but I think if you needed a bit of intervention and guidance, probably not have been so good, So Cambridge, no, to be honest, I felt quite alienated from the college. I mean, the college gave me a studentship and so on, but I really couldn't stand all this dining in hall and getting dressed up and, and I ended up there, so I ended up there by accident because I was very unhappy in a job in London, and then I happened to run into, on the tube, ex-head of the department, John Kenyon, who said to me, "Nasson, what are you doing here?" And we had a long chat, and he said, "You mustn't waste your time being bored out of your skull in the office. You must go and do research and apply to Cambridge." And he told me where to apply. And that's what I did, and that's how I ended up. So I would call it the accidental historian. I mean, that was by accident that I got into history.
What was your thesis?
What was the thesis?
It wasn't a sort of burning, wasn't a lifelong ambition thing to become an historian. I would have probably been happy to almost. I don't know actually, Lindie and Thula. I worked in a factory. I worked on a farm in Norway for 3 years in the summers. So I've always considered myself to be a kind of journeyman, I mean, I'll turn my hand to whatever's interesting. Yeah, it's a job.
What did you find interesting in what was your subject matter?
I wanted to do sort of Indian history, actually. I mean, I was interested in the Indian Mutiny because I'd studied that, or the Indian Rebellion as it's now called. I did that as an undergraduate. And so I was quite interested in doing something on sort of Victorian literature and the Indian Rebellion. And, but by then I had a very steady girlfriend, my current wife. She's very tolerant. And she was going up to the north. And I was going to do this Indian thing in Kent, in Canterbury, and I actually had funding there. And then she went to the north, and so I sort of followed her. And then I went to York, to the Centre for Southern African Studies. So that got me back into sort of South African thing, actually. But that wasn't what So I did that for a year. So I did one of these taught MAs, which are actually just like honours year. They're not that fancy. They're about the same, I'd say. I think taught British MAs are like South African honours. They're not very much higher. And then I got this job at World University Service, working with refugee students from Eritrea and Uganda and Zimbabwe. And then I was getting quite hurtful and pissed off with people, with one person I was working with. who was an American, and she was a vegan and a Quaker, and she kept telling us, why are you having, ham sandwiches? You are disgusting. You should have tofu or something. This was 1977. And anyway, I just, I was quite close to something. And then I ran into him on the tube. So that got me, it's escape. In life, quite often things come like that, and door opens and you just jump, go for it, actually. So so then I went to Cambridge, and
yet you landed in history.
Yeah, and then in between, stop me if I'm boring you.
Yeah, no.
But then in between, then my father died, and I came back to help my mother, and then I sort of thought, well, what's going to happen now, because she's on her own. And then the college had awarded me funding. They actually phoned in Cape Town. They found the number in international directories and said, no, take your time and whatever, we'll hold it for you. So that's how I got to do. And then I worked on Black Society during the Anglo-South African War. And that was mainly because I wanted to do a big thing about, Africans in the war. But then Peter Warwick had already done that at York when I was a student. I knew him there. So, and I still really liked that, because it was a bit of South Africa and a bit of Britain and a bit of empire. And I always wanted a bit more than just South Africa. So that was a way of, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then John said, well, then we had some, and he said, well, no, why don't you just do a restrictive thing about, Natal or the Cape or somewhere? Just do a regional study. Which is perfect for 80,000 words. So that became Abraham Esau's War.
But I find it interesting, Bill, that, if I listen to the story, you actually had your roots in literature, yet you end up in history. And then also come on, the South African War, or as it was definitely known in your days, the Anglo-Boer War, that's the number one Afrikaner nationalist holy cow.
No, of course.
And you decide to go for the cow.
Yeah, but I think it was probably just, to get another sort of window into it, really. I think if I were to write that book now, as the thing from when I wrote it then I would probably write it with a more sympathetic approach to the Boer cause, which I think I did in the South African War, actually. The war for South Africa. I think I was more even-handed in that book, But I also think when I did Abraham Esau's War, you know what it is about? They all say all history is present history. And that was in that sort of period when you were very concerned with civil liberties and rights and so on. I think that there's a lot of that in that book, which was how I was feeling at the time. So I felt, so I think as you get older, you become an old fart or whatever, then you become a bit more sort of detached, and your history becomes less partisan. So I think I would say that now. I think that I think I might have been more partisan then. No, I wouldn't say I was. I think, and now I'm much more detached.
But I will say, though, sorry, Bill, that Abraham Esau's War, the amount of times I come across people citing it, referring to it, it definitely came, I don't know, did it come at a particular moment? Even this past weekend, I was at a function in which people mentioned Abraham Esau's War. I've been on panel discussions where people refer to Abraham Esau's War as this emblem of a forgotten history that has been excavated. So I'd love to know a bit more about, publishing it. But then also, if you say, you grew older, you published that in 1991.
Yeah.
And then The War for South Africa comes out in 1999. So what happens between those two books within the span of 8 years?
Yeah. Well, again, right. So Abraham Esau's War, of course, was based on the thesis. And then Abraham Esau, when I was doing the thesis, I'd never heard of Abraham Esau. And then I just came across this telegram about, this man who'd been murdered by the Boers in California. So that was quite a sort of accident. And then, what the history is like, you start picking away and looking at the papers and so on. So then I sort of used that in the thesis. And then when I did the book, the CUP editor, what's her name? I forget now. I think she said that would make a really good title and sort of work it around that a bit. But it has taken, what does it have? It has traction or something. And I think it's also, Abraham Esau has also become, promoted as a sort of freedom fighter and so on, which is nonsense. So he was a British collaborator, let's face it. He wasn't fighting for human rights in a broader sense. And then, so then I did this other history, which is a general history of that war, which was published in Britain as the South African War. And that was because by then I got interested in the First World War. And at a conference of the First World War, this very famous now, Hew Strachan, wrote the Oxford history of the First World War and so on. So he came over at the conference and we were all having a dop in a bar or something. And he sat down opposite me and he started addressing me as someone else. And he said, how are you getting on with this something or other about, the German Navy in the First World War? And I said, I think you're mixing me up with someone else. And he said, oh, I'm terribly sorry. And then he walked off. And then he came back and he said, oh, by the way, are you Bill Nasson? And I said, someone had told him that. He said, oh, did you write Abraham Esau's War? And when was this? I don't know, years ago. Years ago, actually. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, would you like to do, he's editing this series of books on modern war. So can I do one on the South African War? And again, yeah, why not? So I did. And then I rewrote that into a new version for Tafelberg, which became the War for South Africa. So that's that story, so that came out of that early stuff. But that book's not really that. I don't think. Do I mention Abraham Esau? Maybe, but deliberately not to mention it. Yeah.
Around the same time as you published Abraham Esau's War in '91, you also co-edited All Here and Now with Tom Lodge. How did that book come about? And if you could also situate it, because in your biography it says that you were at UCT from 1982, and we've sort of overlooked your move back to South Africa, your entrance into academia. What were your first years at UCT like, and can you bridge us?
Well, then I was sort of jobless in Britain and looking for, I don't know, it was, when was that, 80... Oh, then I had a job in the early 80s. This thing, lots of PhD students do this, that kind of at a stage in your PhD and you sort of, getting towards writing up. And then there's the temptation of a nice job. And you have this fantasy that you can sort of do this job. And then in the evenings you can, finish off the thesis. And I just think, no, I don't think life's like that. No. Anyway, so I was an example of that. So the job came up in Cambridge, which was about to do a random, I didn't have an interest in the First World War, but I'd grown up with, First World War, plastic soldiers and so on. And that came up, and so I applied for that and got it. And that involved doing the only demographic history I've ever done. So that involved doing a random sample, a 10% random sample of 250,000 files of First World War pensioners, disability pensioners. And so that involved working in the repository of the Public Record Office in Britain, and that was not in Richmond, but in Hayes. And the files had been stored in some warehouse in Lancashire, and they were covered in pigeon feathers and pigeon shit and so on. It was just very messy work. So I did that, and then, so I did that with I was a research assistant, and I had an even more junior research assistant working with me to help. And then at the end of that, oh God, we were getting, So the end of that, a bit of a loose end, and then, and then Anne and I weren't quite sure what was going to happen, and Francis Wilson, who I'd known, he was in Oxford, and he said, oh, well, there's this Carnegie Poverty Inquiry it's starting, and then why don't you come and work on that? And that would be in education, not in history, but well, why not? It's a job. So we sort of came back, and then I worked on that on farm schools actually for 2 years on that. So that was like 82 to 84. So that's, if you see what I mean. So that wasn't about doing any kind of history at all. It was, going around to farm schools in the Western Cape and coming across a couple, one of whom murdered the other one day after, but that's another story. You'll have to read Chameleon for that. Yes, that was in Piketberg. Anyway, so that's what I did. So I worked on this, and then I worked on this education. I was the secretary for this education subcommittee, which had Neville Alexander, Fikile Bum, and various other worthies on it. Yeah, so that took me sort of away from history, but but it was like education. So that, it's a job, and then something came up in oral history at UCT, and that was through Herman Gillemiot, Colin Bundy, who contacted me and said, "Oh, well," but then we'd left actually. I don't know, we weren't in South Africa. And then Herman got hold of me because I'd done a little stukje on Abraham Esau for that. What was that magazine they published? Die Suid-Afrikaan. Herman and Andre du Toit. So I wrote a little stukje there. Yeah, so then there was this oral history thing, and then that was for 2 years. And so I was a sort of research officer in the UCT history department for 2 years. And then during the course of that, Ian Finister, who you will both know, was then sort of moved down and become head of economic history. And there was a job in economic history. And even though, what do I know about economics? Not much about history, but economics even less. And so I applied for that and then got that job. So became a lecturer in economic history, and was there until the early, as in the Department of Economic History until the end of the 80s, early 90s, and then sort of merged with history. And that got me into, so that's how I ended up at UCT.
And can you tell us a bit more about the time at UCT? Tell us about first the economic history department, and then the history department, and the kind of history being done there.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was the sort of ideological. Certainly then there was this. The economic history department was the department for the activists. Okay, I mean, you all know this is folklore now. But that if you were radical, that you did economic history, not history. Even though social, I mean, everyone was quite sociable. So that economic history, you're either Marxist or Marxisant. I mean, in my case, I mean, I never was a hardcore Marxist, but you were materialist in some way. And endless people who did economic history, activists. And what was that like? So I taught. So what I liked about economic history was that I didn't actually teach South Africa, because I taught the first year, of course, the making of the modern world economy, which could keep me away from South Africa. So you did everything but, South Africa, really, from the mid-19th century up to Thatcherism and Reaganomics. But then you could, you had scope for lots of jokes, actually. So I always think that, I was taught by historians who were very witty, and I've absorbed that. So there was a wonderful moment where I had a student. Can I tell you this boring story? There was a student who was eating in the. It was very early on. You know how it is when you start lecturing. You're very nervous and you over prepare. I mean, I was like, you have these, prepare all your lecture notes, and then 3/4 of the way through the lecture, you think, oh my God, I'm never going to be able to finish this. And so then you tell them you'll finish it the next day, and that's a very bad thing to do. I've learned that early on. So then some people would start walking. Anyway, so that was annoying until I got used to getting away with minimum, do less and less, and then whatever. And there was a student who was eating at the back. He was always eating Simba salt and vinegar chips in a 9 o'clock lecture. Like 3 days a week, I would see him, and there was, the same. One day I was in the BT, the BT Theatre at UCT, which is big, takes 400 or whatever. And I was at the front, and And I just saw red one day. I mean, he was in the far left-hand side, and I just stopped lecturing. And I said to this class, we're like 315 there, whatever then, excuse me. And I ran up and sort of grabbed the chips, and I said, like, stop this now. And I turned around, triumphantly, having, vanquished this potato fiend or something. And then I tripped and fell, and the chips went everywhere, and I fell flat, because it's a terrorist sort of whatever. And female students ran up and, can they get me water, etc. And of course, the male students all laughed. But you learn a lot then. Actually, you can't recover from that, especially in front of young people. I mean, students. So you have to make the most of it. Like it's a teaching thing. So what I did for the rest of that semester, I would try to work it into my lectures. Like, I don't know, Hitler had a chip on his shoulder about something. And, so that's the way you get through it, actually. So then it becomes, you are the joke, but then you it's enjoyable to become the joke in a nice way. So I used to find ways of working in salt and vinegar and into the remaining lectures. So that was economic history. So I taught that course, and then I taught the Irish famine as a third-year option at one stage, because I think there are lots of interesting connections between South Africa and Ireland. Not least Karel Schoeman's Ierse Dagboek. Anyway, yes. So that was the other. Yeah. So I enjoyed my years in economic. I enjoyed my years in economic history. I mean, they were
as long as short as you want with All Here and Now, which you did with Tom Lodge. I mean, it's a book which had an impact. I thought it was a good book, actually, and it's nice how to get involved in that.
Yes,
that's a good collection.
That was sort of Tom. I mean, I knew Tom. When I was at York for my MA for the year, Tom was there as a research assistant for John T. Driver. So I've sort of known Tom for years by then. He sadly died a few years ago. So then he just approached me and said, well, I want to do something on the Western Cape and drawing on, Western Cape, the peculiarities of Western Cape politics. So I said, yeah, of course, why not? So that was the origins of that book. Again, just how about this?
When we're talking about the 1980s, I mean, the Western Cape is one of the centers of the UDF. There's a lot of protest on the UCT campus going on. I mean, so much of the transition, in a sense, is centered in the Western Cape. How did you experience that?
Well, how did I experience that? I mean, in various ways. So, if you grew up as I did in the unity movement tradition, you didn't actually, go out in the streets and demonstrate because that was populist. And that wasn't going to bring about, the great change. So then I think I was sort of a little bit skeptical of the UDF as a sort of stalking horse of the ANC, charterism, nationalism, etc. But nevertheless, you couldn't not become affected by it or drawn into it. I mean, all those things about these candlelight vigils and protests and things, and what was happening at UCT, when the police were on the campus and so on. So I don't know, So I remember when we were living in Woodstock in sort of, in Cape Town, we hid an activist and his girlfriend and he was on the run from security police. But that was an interesting experience because then in 1960, my parents had given refuge to Reggie September, who was then on the run after Sharpeville. So I grew up with this experience of having this man in the house, and you don't tell anyone that he's there because he's on the run. He's a fugitive of some kinds. And then prior to all this, we had when Anne and I were living in London, we had this sort of Irish girl who was at that time in the IRA were setting off bombs in London, and we were living in Kilburn, which, if you know London, is a hotbed of Fenians. or was then. But then, we had her as well, sort of downstairs. So it's an odd, like 3 times in my life when the political thing has meant something very personal, because you've had sort of fugitives, people on the hop or on the run, or need to be very careful and concealed. So in that period, in the 80s, so we had this UDF guy, this quite prominent activist in the house, but the people living opposite, I mean, the son was in the police. But he was just an ordinary, constable. So, I mean, he wasn't, he didn't know who was on some list or whatever. And he was, he would see X and wave in the mornings and so on. So it's full of ironies, actually. Yes. So that period, I mean, UCT was quite, pretty. There were some heavy days.
No, exactly that. And I mean, I can see that you make light of it, which I think makes it very easy for people to overlook the fact that you are hiding someone in your basement.
Yes.
It's a very good smokescreen that you managed to put up in the process.
Well, no, indeed, yes. No, and of course you don't talk to anyone about the fact that you've got the person and his girlfriend staying with you. That was for a while, and similarly in the 60s. I mean, 1960, when we had Reggie September, that was, and I was 8, and then I was told by my parents, on no account, if someone knocks on the door asking who's in the house, no account say Reggie's at the back. Yes.
But they also, I'm also interested, Bill, just because the extent to which I can see how you utilize humor. You utilize it in your class. You have now, you have chips on your face. You utilize it in this way to draw attention away. You utilize it in your writing. What is the role of humor in history and in life for you?
Oh my God, what a question. It's really difficult. I don't know. I think maybe you could say, if you want to psychoanalyze, you could say it's a sort of defense mechanism. I mean, I always had very witty and amusing teachers. I mean, people who've influenced me all my life. I mean, my favorite, I can tell you the story. I mean, my favorite, we had this wonderful teacher at high school called Yusuf da Costa, who was a big Unis movement guy. And then we had a system of school inspectors, which of course we no longer have, thanks to SATU. But these guys were mainly, retired Afrikaner bureaucrats and whatever, and they'd come around to sit in on the lesson. And then I remember Yusuf used to say to us, when Meneer Kotze or whatever comes in, just sit, don't stand. Greet him, but don't stand. So Meneer would come in and stand there waiting for us to stand. And we wouldn't, we would just, so then we all have a quiet giggle, and you'd look a bit embarrassed because of the silence and whatever. And we'd then sit down. And the other occasion was that this particular teacher, Yusuf da Costa, had a sort of airy way of teaching. He'd wander around and not really be with us. He appeared to be on another planet. So someone said, one day someone said, well, why, bring in a chicken or something, and roast chicken, and we'll eat it while he's teaching and see if he notices. And well, we did. Someone came with this roast chicken, and everyone had a sticky, under the desk and whatever. And at the end of the lesson, he said, well, next time, remember to leave me a bit of the breast. That's my favorite. But that was it. And that was so. But that for me was like one of the best teaching moments I've experienced, actually. Don't get cross, don't send us to detention, just make us feel stupid. Yes. So
but I love it.
Bit about your time.
Yeah, I mean, I like sort of history that's, I like to be entertained. I think I'm shallow, probably. Yeah.
No, but what I also love about it, Bill, is that humor it can be subversive. It also uses, it's also a form of commentary. But But I would also like to know, I mean,
like, you know, I mean, for instance, Norman Stowe, very conservative, he's dead now, but I'm very conservative sort of Tory historian. And one of my favorite books is his short history of the First World War. And I'm mentioning this because it's very appropriate now. But he has a line in that book where he says that he talks about Russia, because he was originally a historian of Russia. And he says, with the Ukraine, Russia is the USA. Without the Ukraine, Russia is just Canada, mostly snow.
Well done.
It's funny, you laugh, but actually there's a serious underlying point there. So that's what I like, that kind of. Yeah, that kind of.
So in a sense, it's a joke, but it's not, it seems to make light of, but it doesn't.
Yeah.
At the same time, also, you seem to have, what I find interesting is people, the kind of things that would have other people tie themselves up in knots about, you're a bit more cynical of that. But I am interested in, the 90s and the 2000s, because precisely then historians were tying themselves up in knots that was the time of the crisis of the discipline in South Africa.
Yeah.
What was your experience of that?
I don't know. I mean, I think I could be brief. I avoided it, I think. I mean, I don't want to, be glib about it, but I think I sort of avoided. I've never been very interested in theory. And I think that sort of helped. And so people who are very highly theoretical and writing highly theorized, barely comprehensible prose, that's fine, if you do write like that. But, if you like that sort of thing, that's the sort of thing you will like, it's like, it's as with art. So I think I didn't, I didn't feel, I didn't feel sort of particularly affected by it. And I think also because by then my interest was in the sort of history of war of one kind and another. And actually historians of war are all very clear, that generally speaking, unless they're French. But yes, so I think I was able to kind of duck that in a way. Yeah.
Was the department able to duck it as well? Because the crisis speak also goes to problems with enrollment of numbers, and also the rise of where public history moves into the sort of heritage path in terms of trying to find a way of surviving. Were those aspects which were there at UCT departments at the time?
No, I agree with you. All of that. I mean, so you then, I'm all for 1,000 flowers blooming, but then also it becomes so diffuse and that you lose a sort of, I don't know, who, for instance, writes about, South Africa's diplomatic history? Probably nobody, whereas in fact, those are big things. It's a really big area. I remember in the after 94, we had a visit from, what's his face? We used to call him Squeaky, Aziz Pahad, Esau Pahad's brother, who was then deputy something or other in foreign affairs. And he came to the department wanting the department to teach sort of diplomatic history, because South Africa's diplomats could do with a bit of training. It never happened. But thinking back now, 30 years, he's right. Still, you don't get courses in diplomatic history, and that's partly it's partly the nature of things here, that you don't teach your, you don't teach your paper. I mean, when I had history lecturers, they essentially taught their paper. It was essentially their sort of PhD in their principal sort of research topic. So I, for instance, in the second year, you must stop me if I'm digressing too much. In my second year, we had this lecturer called Leslie Price, and I took his course, which was called The Dutch Republic, 1555 to 1795. And that is what he taught for a year. Painting, literature, empire. And he had been a student of C.R. Boxer, the great London University historian who wrote, the Dutch Seaborne Empire, the Spanish Seaborne Empire, the Portuguese. He was one of his PhD students, but that's what Price taught, and actually you came away having learned a hell of a lot in the course of the year. And sometimes he would have seminars in the pub and we'd have beer and so on. And it was, hugely enjoyable. Nice to be a student and to be young.
So do you think the discipline lost some of its breadth? Is that what you're saying with regards to that we lost special
breadth? And I think the substitute for breadth has become more and more about less and less. That's what I honestly think, that you write that, not the two of you, but many people now write masses of stuff about really, tedious sometimes. I mean, I don't know what it is, because, you could argue that, oral histories have always been, almost by definition, quite narrow and so on. But, I always think of that review by David Cannadine of the Dutch margarine industry, which I read years ago. It was published in the History Workshop Journal. And he said, so he wrote this about Van den Berg and Jurgens, who invented sort of modern margarine. And so it's a history of them, the factory and so on. And I don't know what it was, like 800 pages. And he used that phrase more and more, where is history going? There's more and more about less and less. And this is a book where you don't even find out how they make margarine. It doesn't include the recipe. And, and I think what he was saying, well, do we need this?
Yeah. But I think those are important questions also in terms of what we choose to research, what we choose to write about. How do we choose it? And what value does it add?
Yes, and who's going to read it? Who's going to read it and why? And it's those sort of existential questions, You write history. Who are you writing for? Are you writing principally for your colleagues? Or are you trying to, keep history alive by planting it, by watering it, by, keeping up a sort of readership? I find most of the rewarding things, if I take the dogs walking, as I do almost every day in Kilboom Park, and then someone will come up to me and say, oh, I know you, they read The War for South Africa or something, with some old puppy with his Labrador. And that's extremely rewarding, actually. Yeah, more rewarding than some review in whatever, I think.
But then speaking of the books that you have written, and you mentioned now this long course on the Dutch Empire, and my first reaction was, oh my goodness, how do you take up a year on only a few years? And then as you explained, I thought, okay, wait, what I like about that is actually the art of the deep dive, which I think is also lost. Because I just think our history becomes so fragmented at the moment, the way in which we teach it as well. But then, speaking of empires, you did this massive course on the Dutch Empire, but, you published Britannia's Empire in 2004. So tell us about that. What were you trying to do there?
What I was trying to do was to write the history of the British Empire in about 70,000 words. So that, in fact, one of my history lecturers at Hull, Bernard Porter, who's a great historian of British Empire, he's in his sort of 80s now. So he was asked to do this book, a short history of the British Empire, and then he contacted me saying, "Well, why don't you do it? You're much younger than I am," sort of thing, and it might be fun, sort of thing. So I took it on as and it was illustrated, and I enjoyed thinking of the captions for that book. So I don't know, Lindie. That's like also, why not? I'll just give it a go. So I learned various things in the course of that book. I'd written about 30,000 words. And then Clifford the Labrador was lying at my feet under the desk, and the doorbell went. And he jumped up, he's a dog, and he pulled out the plug from the socket. And I then learned that, that's it. The file is buggered, actually. That, if you do that, you take this off, that's okay. But if it's out of the socket, the file is gone. So then so that was, what did I learn then? I don't know. I think I learned. So the problem is, you know this. I mean, you write something, and if you lose it, then you think you've lost perfection, or you can't ever redo it. But then I had to redo it. So I think I learned something from it. Yeah. So actually, I really enjoyed that, because you could use jokes. I mean, I like that actually. The publisher liked jokes. So.
But on that, I'm going to actually jump ahead on, the book that you co-edited with Albert Grinling, The War at Home.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you had a whale of a time thinking up captions for those photos.
Oh,
Would you
yes.
like to share a few of them?
Yes, I enjoyed that very much. Yes, I enjoyed that very much. Yes, I mean, that Empire book, which was actually published in German, was translated into German. So I corresponded with, I sort of did a bit of German at school. I corresponded with the person who was translating it into German. And she was trying to work out some of my captions, because they had the sort of the Lancashire Regiment on the Rock of Gibraltar. So I captioned it, "They are there because they are there because they are there," which is an old 19th century music hall song. And she was, so we were having this interesting thing, and she had "Sie sind da, warum sie da sind," etc. But saying, how are Germans going to get this? Trying to find a German way of conveying that sense of you're just marooned here, really. Yes. No, I enjoyed that, because I could I could sort of work off my prejudices, or some of my prejudices. I mean, I was told by a local publisher that I couldn't call South Africa a banana republic. I won't say which publisher, but I had to, take that out. But I said, Fikile Mbalula calls South Africa. We are not he says we are not a banana republic, which tells you it's in his head, Yeah.
But I remember there was a caption on, what is it, Lord Methuen in bed?
Yes, Lord Methuen, yes. Yes, I can't remember. I know. Yeah, it's around here somewhere, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
and he's not he's not wounded or something.
No, he's not wounded, but he was being fed Samis by Nonnie de Wet, I think, was somebody like it. He was captured. He was captured by de Wet. And de Wet's a vrouw. She fed him, actually. Yes.
Yeah, but it's something
2007 to Springboks on the Somme. Why the shift to World War One?
Well, that was So that was So that I think I talked to you earlier about that project I worked on with Jay Winter, these war pensioners and so on. So that had always, kind of. And then I read quite a lot of First World War stuff then. So I think Jeremy Barain, I think Jeremy Barain was with Penguin at the time, and he said, well, have you thought of doing a book on South Africa in the First World War? So give it a go. And then also by then I'd got through Jay Winter, I'd got sort of interested in First World War things and the conferences on the Somme and Delville Wood, and including P.W. Botha's visit to Delville Wood in 1986. Yes. So that was sorry. Anyway, yes.
Would you describe yourself as a historian of war, if one looks at your publishing record?
Yes, I suppose mainly. I've done. I got into trouble at UCT because we were told we had to make business cards. And so I put on, I put on my business card. We had to have official business cards. So I said historian of sorts. And I don't think that went down too well with the hierarchy. But that I don't know, Lindie. I've got a kind of artisan journeyman sort of feeling about the way about my world of history. That I think I've done I did the politics thing with Tom, and then I've done sort of oral history on District 6. And then war, and I don't know. You know what I mean? I think I'm a yes.
Another dimension of your writing is that you've managed to be both impactful and also prolific, and you've spoken a bit about the importance you feel about writing for the public. Can you tell us firstly, though, a bit about your writing process? How do you get from 0 to 80,000 words? How's your process?
Oh, there was a time in my life when I could do 1,000 words a day. That was Britannia's empire, because after the bloody dog messed up my manuscript, I was then way behind deadline. So then I did 1,000 words a day. And I have a very dear friend, Claire Keaton, an ex-student of mine, works for the Sunday Times. And we discussed this once, and I was talking about the agonies of writing. And she said, you historians are so precious. You have no idea what it's like. If you're a journalist, you know what you have to produce each day. You just have to be disciplined, she said to me. So that was a brief period when I could do, I then did 1,000 words a day. But I'm fundamentally quite lazy, to be truthful. You keep talking about me, but I'm not probably, I don't know. Anyway, I'm quite lazy, I think. But I do enjoy writing, and who do you write for? You write for yourself, in a way. I mean, Charles von Lonsdale said to me once that writing is the best form of therapy, because it's cheap, costs nothing, and it's with someone you can't stand. Yeah. So I think I write principally, I don't know, I think I write principally for myself, probably. I mean, with, the English cricket writer Neville Cardus wrote about writing for the little bird on your shoulder, who's actually you, and that's the first thing you write for. I mean, when I wrote, and also about age, I think, was when I wrote Abraham Esau's War, I was quite conscious of peers and, other academics. So that's why I put in Foucault and stuff, which I would never do now. But I put that in just to kind of cover those bases, as they say. But I think, I like sort of British historians. I mean, British historians of a certain kind just write for a general sort of readership. And I think that's what I aspire to try to communicate as well, as best I can.
Was it 1,000 largely unamended, or did you do your thinking through before you put pen to paper?
I still write.
How did you go about it?
I still write like that. I don't sort of re-edit and I think it all through and then put it down and then lost it. I mean, I don't want to look at it once over.
I will say that I was a PhD student in Stellenbosch's history department, and I began writing up in 2009, and that was when Bill arrived. And I'll never forget it, Bill. It was a tea room conversation in which you spoke of your 1,000-word-a-day principle. I used that to write my PhD.
Did you?
So I did. That was how I wrote my PhD, on the principle of 1,000 words. Everything that I write extra is bonus. It doesn't count towards the next day. No. Every day I start on a clean sheet. And that was some of the best writing advice I'd ever received.
No, that's advice I had from Claire Keaton. She didn't say 1,000 words a day, but she had this thing about the day's not over until you finished whatever it is in your head you need to do. And I still find that very good advice, actually.
But then also, Bill, is what I'm picking up from you, and I like this theme that is emerging, is, your impatience with let's call it the hoity-toityness or the elitism of Cambridge. Yeah. Your later irritation with, theory has a place, but, almost indigestible history. So a sense of irreverence. Is that why the little bird on your shoulder, or writing to yourself, means writing something that, is irreverent towards these conventions and is therefore the kind of thing that, you would like to read and anyone else would like to read?
I think there's something there. Yes, no, I think you have something there. I think it's probably another schoolboy thing about, sending things. Yes.
But then I want to pick up on that because, our paths have crossed a few times in the years in which, you are a regular book reviewer. I mean, you've served on how many adjudication panels for non-fiction awards? And you know, it's also different when you're judging non-fiction as opposed to just judging history. But tell us, and then again, you've brought up your background in literature. So tell us what you think, you know, just in terms of writing in general, you know, writing history, but also writing non-fiction, and what is the state of the kind of writing that, you know, as you see it?
What is the state of writing? God. 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 You mean both? I mean, fiction and non-fiction? I mean,
yes. No, I'm actually, yes, that's why I'm actually really interested in your take on writing.
I don't read a lot of South African fiction. I mean, I used to when I was reviewing for CakeNet, you know, the CakeNet, and for Johan, what's his name, on the Rapport Weekliks. Then I read a lot of, and then when I was doing the Alan Paton thing, then I had to read. But other than that, but that was sort of duty, you know. My national duty, the nearest has come to that. My national duty was that. But otherwise, I don't really read much South African fiction. You live here, it's enough, you know. I read about other places. So I think fiction, I don't know about South African fiction, I read much of that. But the other international, and I think that's in very good shape. Yeah, enjoyable, actually.
But I would actually like your take on, you know, the books you were forced to read, you know, which would have given you something of an idea of our non-fiction landscape, both in English and in Afrikaans. What is your take on that?
I think generally I would say in English, I think it's just they are too over-politicized. Too, I don't know, let me get myself to trouble here, but they too kind of, you know, sort of anal retentive and, you know, pressing all the buttons, whatever. Yeah, I don't know. Yes, that's what I think. And I think, I mean, my experience of having done both, you know, Afrikaans and Engels, is that actually the Afrikaans topics are, I mean, did that for about 4 years, I think. But actually, in some ways, many of them are more interesting than the English equivalent. I mean, I think of that wonderful, who was that? Which one year? Wonderful year. I think it was on Ben for you.
Oh, yes, Karel van der Merwe was.
Karel van der Merwe. I thought that was magnificent. Yeah. It's hard to think of that book winning the Alan Paton Prize, put it that way. A book like that. On my experience of that panel, which is no longer, you know, it's a different panel now, but I mean, I want to disclose things about that panel, but I remember there was one occasion where there was a very fine book, and then the issue was that it was a bit too long. And I speak as one who has a preference for short books. But that seemed to me to be a very poor criteria. You know, if it's a worthy piece of literature, who cares what the bloody length is?
To go back chronologically to your career, you were, I understand, King George V professor at UCT and also head of department. What are your memories of that, and why the move to Stellenbosch in 2009?
The King George, well, that was sort of by default, you know. Yeah, that was sort of by default, and whatever. Nicely imperial, I suppose. But I think I'd sort of reached the stage, and again, I've got actually, they're nearly all retired too at UCT, but I won't be rude about anybody. I think I sort of reached, can I say, my sell-by date at UCT. I mean, I think I'd been there from, you know, 83 to 2007 or 8. And then I got invited to STIAS at Stellenbosch by Bernard and Hendrik. And they were inviting sort of A-rated NRF people then. You could come for a month. And I, you know, never thought of Stellenbosch. I mean, Stellenbosch was vain. I don't know if Stellenbosch was being anything. And anyway, the idea of Stellenbosch. But I went there and I had a really great time. And then, anyway, so I won't go into all the details. But then I thought, well, this is rather nice. And then that, you know, then I found a way of moving sideways to Stellenbosch, which, yeah, I would say my time there, aside from the terrible fire that burnt down everything, was sort of the happiest years of my working life in history, without question.
I want to ask you about that because, again, as I say, I was a student when you arrived, and thoroughly enjoyed, tea time conversations. And then you were there, what, 2 years? It was November 2010 when the fire took place. Tell me about, the loss of an archive, the loss of a library. What did you lose?
I lost sort of everything, actually. I mean, because I think more or less everything. I mean, I had always kept a deliberately small study at home, but I always liked the idea of having another place to which I could flee. So there was the Wilcox building. And I lost, really everything imaginable. Presents from students, and not just books, and research material. But then, I don't know, it was an interesting, I suppose I wanted to write about it, and I've been wanting to write about it ever since, and maybe I never will. It's just it's the abyss, what's that Otto Dix thing about the First World War? The First World War, wonderful German artist, he says, when terrible things happen, you stay into the abyss. And what do you see in the abyss? You see the abyss staring back at you. I probably never will, actually. But then I lost kind of, like everything, like little things inside books but, as an overall experience. And then, of course, you had all this ridiculous stuff about Phoenix arising from the ashes and pep talk stuff because of the world we live in, But for me, I mean, there was a third-year student who came up to me then. And she spoke to me about some holiday home they had on the edge of the Kruger Park, which had caught fire and had burned down. And she said, my net meubels, just furniture. It's not like the loss of books, actually. I remember John Lonsdale, my supervisor, said to me that it's like losing a child, which was about the sum of it, really. Yeah.
But that really tells you something about. Sorry, Bill.
Sorry, no.
No, but it tells you something about being what it is to be a historian, the extent to which we live in our books and in our materials. It's more than, it's not, like you say, it's not furniture, it's not the same thing.
It's not the same, yes. Although in a way it is furniture. I mean, that's the other odd thing, that it's,
and yet it's not to us.
Yes, it's not,
But then...
There's a wonderful essay by Julian Barnes, who's you probably know. I mean, he's a great writer, novelist, about secondhand books, and he talks about what books are, and that books have a smell, secondhand books, and how he loves sniffing at books and looking at old books because they've got wine stains or coffee stains, and then he talks about Kindles, e-readers, and he says, well, he's not against these things, it's the modern world, etc. But can you imagine a Kindle having a smell of anything? But he says maybe one day we will get Kindles with spray on scent, something to give you the illusion that it's literally,
I will recount it as one of my happiest moments. I think it was my son's 6th birthday, and I have a principal. He's 8 now. He's doing well, but he's taking us. Yes, he takes us places. But on his 6th birthday, I have a principle of whenever we give him a birthday or Christmas present, there always must be a book present as well. And he opened up his book present, and the first thing he did was open the book and sniff it.
Yes. Well, there you
and my heart leapt with joy in that moment. But then, as we say, the extent to which books are part of our beings, and what it is to be a historian. But please tell me about History Matters that you published in 2016.
History Matters. Well, what do you want to know? It's a sort of compilation of bits and pieces I've written between when is I should know, 1970, I think, or 71 to 1986, and that came about from a number of people who said, why don't you put together a sort of compendium of pieces you pieces you've written that you really like and would like to stand by. In other words, you write things that you don't want to be associated with sometimes. So they all kind of, almost all actually previously published, but then I sort of re-edited them slightly, so it's an expression of my, I don't know, tastes or the waters into which I've dipped my toe.
Yeah. But then you were also involved in, two rather big general history projects.
Yes.
The one was the Cambridge History of South Africa, of which you were editor of the second volume.
Yes.
And then the other was updating Humour and Mbenga's New History of South Africa.
Yeah.
Please tell us about both.
Both. Well, the Cambridge History, I'd been co-editor of the Journal of African History for a while in the 1990s. And so that came through. Cambridge asked me if I would co-edit. They asked, in fact, Jessica Cooper then said, would I take on the job of co-editing the Cambridge History? And I thought, this is like, herding cats, South Africans, no. So I sort of declined, and then so they said, would I do it if she got other people? Well, then, so that's what happened, actually. So I got sort of tagged along, and that was not the most pleasurable editing, experience I've
What was wrong with it?
Some contributors, let's leave it at that. Yes. No. What I kind of envisaged would happen. So it wasn't easy going. Those things are difficult, If you ask people to write, like with the Journal of African History, if you ask people, there's a word limit. So please send us 8,000 words. But don't send 12,000. Example. Or in the case of the Cambridge History, well, if that's too long, well, can you edit it? Well, no. It reminded me of a conference. That editing experience wasn't all about that. Part of it was about people keeping to the brief. I went to a conference in 1998 where someone was going on and on and on and just not stopping. And the person who was chairing it kept passing little notes, the usual, these conferences, 5 minutes wrap up, and kind of ignored it, looked at it, and then ignored it. And then eventually he made a paper dart, folded an A4 sheet, threw it like that, and sort of hit this guy, who then stopped. And then at the end of that conference, Oxford, there was a sort of round table thing about how it had gone and were there any, whatever. And then this younger speaker, because the guy was chairing was in an autopy. Younger speaker said, but, he thought some of the chairing was autocratic. And the person who chaired his session said, in a wonderfully patronizing way, young man, I presume you're referring to me. And I said, let me give you some advice. If you are asked to speak for 15 minutes, you prepare for 15 minutes. If need be, stand in front of a mirror and talk your presentation. If you are asked to write 5,000 words, you don't write 10, do you? So that was that. Yeah. And then the Humour Mbenga. Yeah, I think this was the publisher, Erica, saying, would I come along and do something on, write something on, about transition and Ramaphosa and so on. That's the South Africa Banana Republic thing I was telling you about earlier. Erica didn't like that. She said, no, that's a bridge too far. Or something. Pity, I would like to have had that in there.
But I'm sure you still had your say in that chapter, though.
I thought.
Otherwise, But tell me something else also, Bill. I mean, we joked at the beginning about, being regarded.
Yeah.
But I mean, you received the NRFA rating, which is the highest
Yes.
rating a researcher in our country can have. And of course, many younger historians, myself not included, aspire to the same. But please, if you had to say, what are the key aspects that a young historian should bear in mind in developing their career narratives, to grow their research in that direction in the way that you did?
I think, God, it's really hard. I mean, I think I would say, don't just be sort of productive and do lots, but try to be expansive and not, I mean, obviously you'll have a center of gravity, but I think it helps to have more than just that, and not just to have a sort of tunnel silo approach to things, but if possible, stretch things as much as you can, so that you can attract a sort of wider, a wider kind of, because you need a kind of, some international recognition and standing if you're aspiring to those baubles. Yeah. Yes. So I mean, I've got that, but then I've never reapplied actually.
Should young what would your advice? So broadening it out. Okay, what would your advice be to a young historian? Not forcing them into the NRF, because it seems as though you don't rate it as being the absolute alpha and omega of your career. What would your advice to a young historian just completing their PhD, lucky enough to get a tenure track job? What would your advice be, looking at the other end of the career?
Oh God. Read things other than history, I think, is what my advice would be. Read historical novels. I mean, if possible, if you're interested in a particular period or area, then try to read fiction about that. I mean, I think I was lucky because when I was an undergraduate, so I did at the University of Hull, so I did English and history, sort of joint honors. But then what you did was that you did the literature of the period that you were studying. Not all of it. I mean, obviously not the Dutch Republic, but I mean the other things, so that I did a course called, I don't know, Britain and its Empire, 1850 to 1970. But then with that, you did sort of Victorian and Edwardian literature. And so there was a fictional, a fictional add-on or a fictional expansion or something of that area. So I think if I were to think of books that sort of stay in my head, I mean, obviously there are history books, but a lot of them are about kind of really great novels about historical, J.G. Farrell, The Siege of Krishnapur. If you want to know what India was like in the middle of the 19th century, read that and read the history, that would be my advice. I mean, I don't know.
Could you tell them about trade writing and the response to people who say that it will limit your seriousness if you're not writing for a university press?
Well, I think, yes. Well, I mean, people have said that to me. Well, if you're in that treadmill, then I guess, you have to. I mean, I don't know, actually. You don't have to write for a university press, I think. But I suppose, again, it depends on what you want. That I think if you want to get on that academic ladder and you want to be read by and praised by and reviewed by and fawed over by other academics, then you write like that. I mean, I've had an academic colleague, or a man nameless, who said to me, well, why do you write the kind of books you write rather than, more prestige, whatever? And I said, well, I would prefer to be read by people, and she said to me, oh, well, I don't mind. I don't mind if 25 people read something I've written. That's enough if they count, But it depends who counts. You know what I'm saying? That's what it is.
So, Bill, another thing I want to ask you about, just taking all of this together.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I've always liked about your work is, apart from the fact that it's witty, and well written and accessible. I want to say something in terms of the historical imagination, what you just mentioned now, in terms of reading the literature of a period, the extent to which historians are not only empiricists, but we also imagine the past. I would like to know your thoughts on that.
No, of course, because creating the past, I mean, in a way that, you are. I mean, we can get back to elementary history 101 or something, but you are, you are bringing the past into putting flesh on the past or bringing it into some actual existence. And I think that does. So it is an imaginative act, So I've probably got an old-fashioned view. I mean, I think that history is history is fundamentally a literary craft. That's not very fashionable to say these days, I'm sure, but I do believe that, actually.
But then I want to just follow up on that, because then where does theory come in? If we're talking about it as imaginative literary craft,
I always think there's always obviously theory, but I think in a non-clunky way. But again, it also depends on how it depends on your literary ability or something. But that to find ways of infusing theory without, like E.P. Thompson. I mean, the great historians are able to do all that, but without banging over the head with it. I mean, I think that's what it is, and that's I mean, E.P. Thompson, when he talks about being a non-Marxist materialist, he explains it beautifully, actually, So, yes,
Another thing he explains beautifully, I was listening to the Round Table. It's a social sciences seminar. It's one of the things I listen to, as Lindie knows, during the day. I've got my earphones on. It's one of the things I'm listening to. Everybody always thinks that the easier path is to be a so-called literary historian. But as he has actually said, the toughest test of his expertise is narrative, because you are fusing multiple you're moving from the economy to the society to sociology to the battlefield. It's much easier to abstract one particular theme and write about it in an abstract way, which is why it's more particular. And also not just interdisciplinary, but also multi-thematic as well. It's much more difficult. I would have a much easier task writing this theoretical stuff. Anyway, that's my pet cry. It's apropos of nothing, and it's not a question to be answered. So I'll just pass it over to Lindie to move us forward.
I think that's fair enough. That's fair enough, actually. Yes.
Well, I think Thula, you're preaching to the choir, because to me, narrative is everything, and people don't appreciate how difficult it is.
Yes. No, of course.
But Bill, if you had to say, what would you think of the state of history as a discipline today?
You mean in this country, or?
Let's start here and then move abroad.
Make it broad, whatever you think. What do you view the discipline?
I mean, I think history is quite, I don't know, what is it now? It's quite fragmented and fragmentary. I don't think that there's a great hydraulic sense or purpose behind history. I mean, but I think if it means let 1,000 flowers bloom, well, let them bloom. I mean, a lot of what now is called history seems to be not really to be history. We don't get onto this, but I mean, it seems to me shades into cultural studies and so on. But the fact that you have, you can have great new branches of history, I think is a good thing. They can also be gobbledygook. I mean, but we won't get onto that. That will just be my prejudices. So I won't parade them. So I don't think history is in a bad state. Generally, there are good history books being written still.
If we were to press you to choose your 3 favorite history books all time, no limitations, which one would you go for?
Good. I mean, that's difficult. I mean, if you were to say my 3 favorite books, probably none of them would be history, but I would say yes. You sent me that question. I was pondering that, and I suppose if you were asking, are they books that I sort of have like to hand, so that if I'm going to pick up something and cheer me up, or then the three would be these, and they're not about South Africa. There's one by Roy Foster, who's a wonderful Irish historian, called oh God, what's that called? The Irish Story, and the subtitle is Telling Tales and Making Things Up in Ireland. You could apply that to South Africa, actually. We tell tales and we make things up, and it's a series of essays about about writers and about the IRA and about the famine, and he's a great sort of writer. So they're sort of short essays, and it's a short book, quite short. I was telling you I like short books. So that would be one, and another one would be Norman Stone's World War One: A Short History. That's another short book. But that's that's a book like a sort of firecracker. It sort of goes off, and it's full of, I don't know, like just great stuff, actually. I mean, I had no idea about the links between Turkey and Germany. Did you? I mean, no, so that the Bethmann Ulrich, the German foreign minister in 1913, spoke French, German, and Turkish. But I thought there was, post-war gusto. So there's a long connection, and it's full of that stuff. Full of stuff, about the state of the Tsarist. The state of the Tsarist Empire was so bad, was that the Tsar licked his own stamps. And that's wonderful, actually. The German General Brusilov had piles, so he could never sit on his horse. So he could only address his troops when he was standing in the stirrups. That stuff, yeah, you can't make it up, Norman looked at the hospital records, it's based on proper research, actually. So that would be another one. Norman Stone, a short, and the third one would be David Canada and The Pleasures of the Past, which again is a collection of sort of reviews and essays about houses and the royalty and aristocracy, and yes, and those are books I kind of, when I'm stuck and I just want to pick up something, those are the history books there are other books that I'd probably put ahead of them, but if I had to name history books, they would be those. Yeah.
Which would your fiction ones, which you would place ahead of them, be?
Oh God, that's endless. Oh God. I read a lot of journalism, like sort of scholarly journalism. So I like Christopher Hitchens, arguably. I like A.A. Gill, The Angry Island. So those would be, and I'm currently, and I recommend this, I'm currently reading a book called Discontent, a novel. Narrative, first person, not long, 160 pages, by a Madrid writer called Beatriz Serrano, and it's about it's quite good, actually, because it's about the world we're in, the world of TikTok and Zoom and Teams and so on. And she works in Madrid, and she's depressive, and she takes Ativan, and she pops pills and so on. And it's a novel about low-level suicide. She never commits suicide, but each day she has these low-level suicidal thoughts. It's a book for our time, I think. So I love that, actually. Look out for it. I recommend it. It'll cheer you up, even though it's dark, because it has a nice ending.
Sounds like a lovely
and of course
read.
it's good, you see, because it also has references to Franco and the Spanish part, so that's why I like it, actually.
It does indeed sound like a book for our time, but
yeah, no, it's a book.
With that being asked, then final question, Bill, that the big question: what are you working on now?
Well, there's always the myth about my Sailor Milan story, which is on the sort of back burner, but I lost all that stuff in the fire. So, so I think I'm still hopeful if I still have a few years of life left. But I'm finishing this collection of collection of it's not an autobiography, but a collection of sort of personal essays. Well, you've seen one. Thula can see it now. Called Chameleon for Clear Monarchy. So it's a bit about, it's not a chronological autobiography, but it's sort of memoir essays, personal experiences. So I'm enjoying that. I'm trying to finish it now. So in the next month or two, I'll have finished.
And I suppose if I had to ask you, why is it called Chameleon?
Why Chameleon? It's partly as I sort of grew up in a garden with lots of chameleons, and they've always sort of intrigued me. That sort of shifting move, adaptable. So I think that's. What am I saying? Shed your skin, you move around. I don't know. I think in a way, I feel a bit, chameleon-y, something. I think that's what it is. Actually, So that's why they may not like it. I mean, publisher may not like it as a title, but I do. I think it fits. It's there probably is some very fancy term for it, today, but it fits. I don't know. Yes, it fits being slightly slippery and adaptive. I think that's the story of my life. I think that is the story of my life. Slip around, move sideways and hang on and, shift around.
Yeah, I would think of chameleons as also roaming creatures. And I think this is part of what we got from you today, was this roaming. And thank you for that.
Well, I've enjoyed this very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you for your time, Bill. Thank you very much.